Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Killer from 2023. This is a movie that was produced and released on Netflix, which I think is always noticeable just because it says certain things about the production process and what is and isn't standard about that compared to the rest of Hollywood. And also because of what it means for its visibility, both good and bad. The reason, I have to say, just as a side note, as a general side note, I think it's fair to say that at this point, if I'm going to find out about a new movie that I haven't heard of before, and especially one that's coming out like at the time, the most likely way that I am going to find out about a new movie coming out is I am going to see somebody having clipped a GIF of it and made it into some sort of video or image meme, and the line that a character is saying being weird enough and the visuals being odd enough for me to go, what the heck is that? And just looking it up. And that's what happened with this. Somebody clipped a line from the film, and I said, that's weird. And also, that's Michael Fassbender. What's this about? And I found it that way. And so, as much as I rail against, like, advertising in general, I think that's a form of organic publicity that please don't just start making memes to make your film sell. I will be really annoyed if I've already seen corporations attempting memes, and we need to stop that. Please, I'm begging you, do not do that. So I'm not encouraging that to happen. I'm saying if it happens organically, it's probably a good sign. Anyway, what's particularly interesting is that I probably wouldn't have, I don't know when I would have found out about this film, if ever. And looking into it after, I'm going to spoil my feelings a little bit here. This should have been a movie that I loved. And unfortunately, it is mostly a movie I'm just kind of okay with. So in addition to like having a bunch of qualities that are in a genre and in a form that I enjoy, and with a bunch of sort of qualities of subtlety and what's the word I'm looking for? Subtlety and understatedness that I really appreciate, and I talk frequently about how movies are often just very over the top for no apparent reason, other than to be bombastic. This should have already been something I was into. And on top of that, finding out that this was directed by David Fincher, a director who I like very, very much. And I think I've mentioned before, he's one of my favorite directors. And with a cast, including some people I really enjoy, and with a score done by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, who are some of my favorite composers in recent era. I mean, musicians turned composers. This all should have added up to a fantastic film. Obviously, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross have worked with David Fincher before. That's a whole other thing. If you're already familiar. Yeah, anyway. But this should have been something I adored. I have been trying to pick apart this film since I've watched it and try and figure out what's going on that's wrong with it. And some of it is very obvious and some of it is not. So let's talk about the good first. Although it did not have certain specific qualities that I tend to see from David Fincher in his directorship, reflecting on it, I can see some of the qualities of his filmmaking in general that are definitely there. There are a few experiments that he did in here, and every one of his films has some sort of effect or style experiment that I do not like. It's just, but I still adore his work because, on the whole, he is very innovative and makes very visually striking things. There's one scene in particular. Let's just say the camera is basically shaking the whole time, and it works, but it needs to be intermittent, not the whole time, because at some point your eyes just kind of glaze over and it hurts to look at it. It's contextually appropriate, but it's an unfortunate choice that was made for that entire scene. There's like one other, I think, that bothered me a little bit. But on the whole, the cinematography is extremely good. I could go on for quite a long time on the qualities of Fincher's cinematography and directing, but in particular his very good use of contrasting light and darkness is always something that is very appreciable. And he's not the only one who can do that, and I wouldn't have, again, stylistically necessarily identified this as a Fincher film without knowing, without looking it up or reading his name. But seeing it upon reflection, it absolutely shows quality, a lot of the same qualities that he usually shows being very good. This film is also cast quite well. In fact, there are some people in this film that were cast in roles that I did not properly identify them in. Like, I saw their name come up, and then I never saw them in the film, and I had to go look up who they played, because a combination of good acting, good makeup, and good costuming really adds up to, a good actor being able to do good acting. And the score is incredible. And in fact, I'm a little embarrassed I wasn't able to identify it as a Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross score, because there are certain qualities in it that are really only sounds that those two make. I adore their scores. I adore the sort of pseudo-ambient sort of metal that they make. And they show a lot of different sides in this film. I also want to point out in particular that at least for a good chunk of the film, all of the sound is diegetic. That meaning that it's all in-world. So most of the music that's playing up until, well, actually, now I'm reflecting on this differently as I'm saying it out loud. The first half of the film, all of the sound is diegetic. The second half of the film, and there's not like a clear cut here, I'm just saying second half in a general sense, there's suddenly a lot more non-diegetic music. Because of the style of Reznor and Ross's music, that also means that, like, sometimes it's not necessary, it's hard to determine the line between music and sound effects. And that's something I really appreciate about them, and it is used to good effect in this movie. Scoring something where the sound effects of the world, or something you think is the sound effects of the world, turn into, like, sort of rise up into becoming music is just a fantastic ability to have in general, and really adds a lot to the immersion. So let's talk about what's wrong with it. The problem is the script. And the problem is that I would like most of the script to be cut out. Because it's bad and because it's unnecessary. There is very little talking in this film already. The number of characters that actually have lines is pretty short. The lines that they have are reasonably short as well. Most of the storytelling is done in visuals and in sound. And for the most part, the actual in world conversations that are had work very well. The problem is that 80% of the script is narration by Michael Fassbender's character, and it sucks. Like, maybe I'm being a little too hard on it, but like, it grows on you how bad it is. It's initially presented as sort of like a mental narrative, but it sort of ends up at a point of reading more like a high schooler's diary, including unfunny jokes that just, they're not there to be unfunny. They're clearly there to actually, be a sort of dry humor, but they're planted and delivered in such a weird space and time that having that actually be read just sounds bad. And it took me until about maybe a third of the way through to go, oh, not only is this dialogue bad, the movie would be more impactful if it lost almost all of it. I'm not sure. You'd have to make some minor tweaks in the monologue, add some things in other places in order to replace a few things that are actually necessary in the monologue. But having the character narrate the whole way through was a terrible decision, and I don't know why they did that. To be fair, because the script is so sparse already, that would mean that for like the first 25 minutes of the film, there might not be a line of dialogue. There might be a few, but like, there are so few lines of dialogue already that the monologue seems like it should be important, but because it's already artistically very solid in other ways, other than the compulsion for Hollywood not to do particularly artsy things, and the necessity of producers sticking their noses where they don't belong and not letting people just let art breathe, it would have worked better just having like almost no dialogue for the first 20 minutes or so. It's just not necessary almost at all. What makes it worse is because what makes it worse is it almost works, because we're trying to get a sense of our main character and his relationship to his job and the people around him. And I think characterizing a character who is sociopathic, I guess this is technically minor spoiler, but it should be kind of obvious, who is, and I'm not going to spoil deeply, but I'll skim the surface, who is sociopathic and sort of an unreliable narrator. I think that has some qualities that really could have worked. The problem is our character never settles into a clear line of who they're supposed to be. So this character could go multiple different ways, is basically the way I was thinking about it. Either the character is a much more practical version of a movie assassin, somebody who shows that like, it's not because they're a superhuman, it's not because they're just the coolest guy, it's because they're super meticulous and they like do all these things that make them good at what they do. And there could be a dark side to that, and I think that's sort of what the movie starts to touch on. This also could go to a place of like looking at the sort of mental illness or sociopathy or whatever else that is necessary to cut yourself off, either because you had it before, or by virtue of doing the job of being an assassin, that you have become sort of through through process of experience, put yourself, become a person with qualities that would put you in sort of those categories. Or it could go another way, where our character becomes sort of minorly tragic as somebody who believes themselves to be this like incredibly competent person, but because of as they go through and they succeed or fail at certain things, and then they validate the outcome purely based on like their own worldview that may be distorted and that they may be reporting to the audience like incorrectly. That could be both interesting as a sort of idea of an unreliable narrator, or it could go to a point of having a sympathy for a character who is clearly not to be rooted for and not a good person, but also is sort of tragic in the sense of having become something they don't that they tell themselves they're not, or believing that they have basically having tricked themselves into being in this world, and not being as happy as they say they are, and being sort of tragically failing at being a person in a way. And I think all three of those scenarios have threads in this movie. These are not, I'm not just making these up. These are things that I saw, but it doesn't go for any of them. It just sort of meanders between them, and by the end, I had no real connection to our character. I didn't believe everything he said. I didn't believe his motivations necessarily. I couldn't be empathetic towards his like the lies he was telling himself, or the way that he interacted with his own like mentality about it. I just couldn't get to him. He was sort of untouchable in this sort of sad way. And I think a lot of that is down to that monologue, where he starts to, there are scenes outside of that monologue that point to these things as well, but with the majority of the dialogue being in that monologue, or the majority of the text, you know what I mean, having him not, be so overt about what he says and talking in this very intimate way, but to never actually become any of those characters, and to be sort of almost boring by virtue of that, is a real failure. What almost works is that the people he plays off of are all really well played. And so like he has these people who he knows of or finds out about in various capacities in his life, and his interactions with them are all really interesting, regardless of whether that's a positive or negative interaction, because him playing off people who are not like him is sort of adds the most depth of character to him, to see how he interacts with somebody who's who understands something about him, or doesn't understand something about him, or believes they know something and he's like reacting to their reaction to him. It's a really interesting dynamic every time it happens. So like that's where all the best interactions in the film really are. And I don't think you would have to change all that much in order to just remove the monologue completely, tweak a few things here and there, and watch this character walk through their life saying almost nothing. He has almost no lines already, other than his monologue. So watching him react to that would have been that much more powerful with the silence by comparison. I also think that I really like Michael Fassbender as an actor. I think that he is underrated, and I think that is in no small part because his casting history has largely been sort of mediocre. But every once in a while, I see some really extraordinary acting from him, and I would have liked. This was almost that opportunity to show all of that. Especially because he's a character who's very cold and needs to, like, that requires an amount of finesse and subtlety in the acting to show that it is a character who's cold, but not without emotion, not without, like, feeling, not without intention. They're not a human. They're still a human being, but they're, like, whatever their reason for being cold has these other things underneath it. So, like, there's so many elements of this that should add up to it being really extraordinary. Unfortunately, it's mostly those couple of things that sort of sabotage it from really the first moment and set me up, not going in, not knowing almost anything about the film, set me up with nothing, but then, like, slowly drip fed me an inconsistent and sometimes uninteresting narrative to process. And that's a shame with everything else in this movie that goes on that's so good. I think I'm working myself in circles here just because that's where it's at in my head, of just not being entirely sure how I feel about it. I really want to like it. It's probably something I will watch again, and probably something I will even recommend to other people. It's not a bad film by any means, and it is not less than the sum of its parts either. It's just that it has these couple of flaws that, because of its subtleties, it ends up being a kind of a problem, kind of impacts the overall outcome. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.